"Will you stay and love me too?" asked 7-year-old Rose Donovan to the Chippewa woman abandoned at the train station, her small voice cutting through the bitter Montana wind like a prayer whispered to a stranger who might be her last hope. For family. This is the story of how two outcasts found each other in the unforgiving frontier, where love had to be stronger than prejudice and a child's courage changed everything. The morning train wheezed to a stop at Copper Ridge Station. Like a dying animal, black smoke billowing against the pewter sky as passengers hurried to disembark before the next blizzard hit. Nehemana Starweaver stepped onto the wooden platform with nothing but a worn leather satchel and a letter that had brought her 800 miles from the Leech Lake Reservation in Minnesota, her dark hair braided with traditional beadwork that caught the pale sunlight like small prayers woven into her very being. She wore her finest dress, deep blue calico with silver buttons her grandmother had traded for, and moccasins that whispered against the rough planks as she searched the crowd for a face she'd never seen but hoped would bring her the new life Thomas Brennan had promised in his carefully written letters.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
The station bustled with ranchers collecting supplies, miners heading to the copper claims in the hills, and families wrapped in thick coats against the November cold that bit through wool and settled in bones like winter's own curse. Nehemana clutched the letter tighter, reading Thomas's description for the 100th time. Tall, broad-shouldered, brown hair, wearing a black hat with a silver band. The words had given her hope during the long journey from everything she'd ever known. Hope that somewhere in this vast territory a man might see past her Chippewa blood to the woman beneath. But as the minutes stretched into an hour, as the platform emptied and the train prepared for its westward journey to the mining camps beyond the mountains, that hope began to crack like ice under spring sun. No tall man with brown hair appeared. No one asked for Nehemana Starweaver. No one even looked at her directly except to stare with the mixture of curiosity and suspicion she'd learned to recognize wherever white settlers gathered. The ticket master, a thin man with spectacles perched on his nose like a schoolteacher, approached with the weary air of someone accustomed to delivering unwelcome news. "Miss, you waiting on someone particular?" he asked, his voice not unkind but edged with the efficiency of a man who had a schedule to keep and problems to solve quickly. "Train's pulling out in 10 minutes, and we don't allow folks to camp on the platform overnight. Town's got rules about that sort of thing, what with winter coming and all." His eyes took in her dress, her beadwork, the careful way she held herself like someone prepared for rejection, but determined to maintain dignity despite it. "I am meeting Thomas Brennan," Nehemana said, her English precise and clear, learned from the missionary teachers who had come to Leech Lake when she was young and eager to understand the white world that pressed closer to her people's land each year. "He sent for me to be his wife. We have been writing letters for 6 months. And he said he would meet me here at the November 15th train." She showed him the letter, its edges soft from handling, Thomas's handwriting neat and promising across the yellowed paper. The ticket master's expression shifted from impatience to something approaching sympathy, mixed with awkward embarrassment. The look of a man who had seen this particular tragedy play out before and knew how it ended. "Ma'am, I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but Thomas Brennan was here this morning. Saw him myself when the train whistle blew, standing right there by the freight office." He pointed to a spot near the cargo wagons where men loaded supplies bound for the outlying ranches and mining claims. "Then where is he?" Nehemana asked, though part of her already knew the answer, had felt it in the way people's eyes slid past her when she first stepped off the train, in the silence that had greeted her arrival instead of the welcome she'd imagined during those long miles of hoping. Did something happen? An accident? She tried to keep hope alive in her voice, even as it died in her chest like a campfire doused with snow. "Well, miss, I reckon he took one look and decided he'd made a mistake," the ticket master said with The blunt honesty of frontier life, where pretty lies were luxuries people couldn't afford. Saw him talking to Sheriff Morrison, then he mounted up and rode out toward his spread without so much as a howdy-do. Some folks, they get ideas about what they want in a mail-order bride, and when reality shows up, they lose their nerve. He removed his spectacles and cleaned them with his handkerchief, giving her a moment to absorb the blow. The words hit Nehemana like a physical force, driving the breath from her lungs and leaving her standing alone on the platform with nothing but the clothes on her back and the sudden understanding that she was 800 miles from home with no way to return and no one to turn to in this hostile place. She had sold everything she owned to pay for the train ticket, had left behind her grandmother and her cousins, and the only life she'd ever known because Thomas Brennan's letters had painted pictures of a different future, one where a Chippewa woman might find acceptance and love on the Montana frontier. What am I supposed to do now? She asked, the question escaping before she could stop it, vulnerability bleeding through her carefully maintained composure like water through cracked earth. The wind picked up, sending dust devils dancing across the platform and rattling the station's wooden sign with its peeling paint that proclaimed Copper Ridge in letters that had once been bright yellow but now faded to the color of old bones. The ticketmaster replaced his spectacles and looked at her with the uncomfortable sympathy of a man who wanted to help but had no solutions to offer. There's a boarding house on Main Street, run by Mrs. Patterson. She's fair in her dealings, though she charges city prices for country rooms. Hotels full up with minors, and the saloon's no place for a respectable woman. He paused, considering his words carefully. Might be you could find work at one of the ranches, cooking or cleaning, though most folks around here are particular about who they hire. If you take my meaning. Nehemana understood his meaning perfectly. She was Native American in a territory where most white settlers viewed her people as threats to be contained or obstacles to be removed, not potential employees or neighbors. The recent troubles with the Crow to the south had only made tensions worse, and a lone Chippewa woman would be seen as suspicious at best, dangerous at worst. The fact that she could read and write, that she spoke English as well as any white woman, that she knew both traditional healing and modern medicine from the reservation doctor, none of that would matter to people who saw only her dark skin and braided hair. As the train whistle shrieked its final warning and the last passengers hurried aboard, Nehemana found herself truly alone for the first time in her 24 years, standing on a platform in a town that didn't want her. With winter approaching and no clear path forward, she watched the train disappear around the bend that led toward the mountain passes, its smoke trailing behind like the ghost of her abandoned dreams, and tried to summon the strength her grandmother had taught her, the resilience that had carried her people through generations of displacement and loss. That's when she noticed the small figure huddled behind the cargo boxes, a child with tangled auburn hair and clothes that had seen too many washings, too many patches, too many nights of uncertain sleep. The girl couldn't have been more than 7 years old, but her green eyes held the watchful wariness of someone much older, someone who had learned that safety was temporary and kindness often came with conditions. She clutched a rag doll with yarn hair and a dress made from the same faded calico as her own, as if the toy were the only constant in a world that shifted like sand beneath her small feet. The child had been watching Nehemana with the intense curiosity children reserve for anything different or unusual, but also with something else, something that looked almost like recognition, as if she saw in this strange woman something familiar, something that called to the loneliness that radiated from her small frame like heat from a banked fire. When their eyes met across the platform, the girl didn't look away as the adults had, didn't shift uncomfortably, or find sudden urgent business elsewhere. Are you lost too? The child asked, stepping out from behind the cargo boxes with the careful bravery of someone who had learned to be cautious, but hadn't yet given up on human connection. Her voice carried the slight accent of Irish immigrants, the musical lilt that had come to Montana territory with families fleeing poverty.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story.
And famine in search of land and opportunity. I've been waiting here since yesterday, but nobody's come for me yet either. Maybe we could wait together. Naimana knelt down to the child's level. Something in that small voice calling to the maternal instincts she'd kept carefully buried during her years of waiting for a husband who might never come, for a life that might always remain just beyond reach. "What is your name, little one?" she asked gently, using the soft tone she'd learned from watching her grandmother with the reservation children, the voice that promised safety without demanding trust too. Quickly. "Rose," the girl said, clutching her doll tighter. "Rose Donovan. My mama and papa died when our wagon went through the ice crossing Miller's Creek last month, and the preacher said I had to go live with my cousin's family in Billings, but they never came to get me. Mrs. Henderson at the general store said she couldn't keep me anymore because I eat too much and her husband's already complaining about the extra mouth to feed." The words tumbled out in the way of children who had grown accustomed to explaining their circumstances to strangers. The story hit Nahimana like a physical blow. This child abandoned as surely as she had been, left to survive on the charity of people who saw her as a burden rather than a blessing. Rose's situation was different but somehow parallel to her own. Two unwanted souls thrown together by circumstances beyond their control in a place that seemed to have no room for either of them. The irony wasn't lost on her that she had come here seeking family only to find another person who had lost everything. "Where have you been sleeping?" Nehemana asked, noticing the way Rose's clothes hung loose on her small frame, the hollow look around her eyes that spoke of too many nights of worry and too few meals that filled the empty spaces where security should have been. The November wind was growing stronger, carrying the scent of snow from the mountains and the promise of a winter that would be particularly harsh for those without proper shelter. Sometimes in the church if Pastor Williams doesn't lock the door, sometimes in the stable behind Johnson's feed store, Rose admitted, her voice growing smaller with each word. "I try not to bother anybody, and I help Mrs. Henderson sweep the store in exchange for biscuits sometimes. But she says I can't keep doing that, because people are starting to talk about why there's an orphan child hanging around with nowhere proper to go." The picture that emerged was heartbreaking in its familiarity to anyone who had experienced displacement and rejection. Rose was surviving on scraps of kindness from people who saw her as a temporary problem that would somehow solve itself, while winter approached with its deadly indifference to the plight of the vulnerable and alone. Nehemana thought of her own grandmother, who had taken in more than one abandoned child over the years, who had taught her that family was not always about blood, but sometimes about choice, about seeing need and responding with love rather than calculation. "Rose," Nehemana said carefully, testing the name on her tongue like a new prayer, "what would you think about staying with me for a while? I find myself in need of a friend, and it seems you might need one too. We could look out for each other until we both figure out what comes next." The offer surprised her even as she made it, but something about this child's courage in the face of abandonment reminded her of her own younger self, and she couldn't bear the thought of walking away from such obvious need. Rose's green eyes widened with hope so pure and desperate it was almost painful to witness, the expression of someone who had been disappointed so many times that good fortune seemed impossible, but still clung to the possibility like a drowning person grasping for a rope. "You mean it? You wouldn't mind having me around? I'm real quiet, and I know how to help with cooking and cleaning and mending. And I won't eat much, I promise. Mrs. Henderson always said I was more trouble than I was worth, but I could try to be better." "You are not trouble," Nehemana said firmly, placing her hands on Rose's thin shoulders and looking directly into those hopeful green eyes. "You are a child who deserves to be cared for and protected and loved, not made to feel like a burden for existing." Anyone who cannot see your worth is blind to what truly matters in this world. The words came from someplace deep in her heart, from the part of her that had always dreamed of children of her own, but had resigned herself to spinsterhood on the reservation. Rose's chin trembled as if she might cry, but instead she threw her small arms around Naimana's neck with the fierce desperation of someone clutching at salvation. "Will you stay and love me too?" she whispered against Naimana's shoulder, her voice muffled by fabric and hope and the fear that this moment of kindness might disappear as quickly as it had come. "Everyone always leaves or sends me away, but if you could stay, just for a little while, I promise I'll be good." The words pierced Naimana's heart like an arrow finding its mark, carrying all the weight of this child's abandonment and all the echoes of her own rejection just hours before. In that moment, holding this small, brave girl who had asked for so little and been given even less, Naimana understood that sometimes the family you're meant to have doesn't come through marriage, proposals and carefully planned arrangements, but through the unexpected grace of finding each other when you're both lost. "Yes, little Rose," she whispered back, her own voice thick with emotions she hadn't allowed herself to feel during the long journey from Minnesota. "I will stay, and I will love you. We will figure out how to build a life together. You and I, we may not be what the world expects, but we will be family to each other." As she spoke the words, she felt something shift inside her chest, a sense of purpose and belonging that had nothing to do with Thomas Brennan's broken promises and everything to do with this moment of mutual rescue. The ticket master had been watching this exchange with growing interest, and now he approached them with the careful steps of a man who recognized something significant happening but wasn't sure whether to interfere or offer assistance. "Begging your pardon, miss, but that child's been the town's unofficial ward for the past month. And if you're thinking of taking responsibility for her, there might be some folks who'd want to have a say in the matter. Sheriff Morrison, for instance. And Judge Crawford. They've been trying to figure out what to do with her since the Hendersons said they couldn't keep her anymore." Naimana stood, keeping one protective arm around Rose's shoulders, feeling the child press closer to her side, like a small animal seeking shelter from a storm. "Are there legal procedures I must follow?" she asked, drawing on the dignity her grandmother had taught her. "The way to stand tall even when the world tried to make you feel small. I am willing to provide for this child's needs and give her a proper home. Surely that is better than leaving her to survive on charity and sleep in stables. Well, normally there'd be questions about your circumstances, your ability to provide, references from people who know your character," the ticket master said, clearly uncomfortable with the complexity of the situation. "But seeing as how the child's got no other prospects and winter's coming fast, might be the sheriff would be willing to make an exception, especially if you can prove you've got means to support her. Town's got enough problems without adding a frozen orphan to the list come January." Rose looked up at Naimana with eyes that held a mixture of hope and terror, clearly understanding that this conversation would determine her immediate future, and possibly her survival through the approaching winter. "I can work," she said quietly, addressing the ticket master with the earnest desperation of a child who had learned to negotiate for her own existence. "I'm strong for my size, and I learn fast. If Miss Naimana takes me, I won't be a burden on anybody in town anymore." The practical nature of Rose's plea struck Naimana as both heartbreaking and admirable, this 7-year-old child already understanding that her worth was measured by her utility rather than her inherent value as a human being. It was a lesson Naimana knew well from her own experience navigating a world that saw her people as obstacles to progress rather than individuals with their own dreams and desires and rights to exist peacefully on the land their ancestors had called home for generations. "I have some money saved," Naimana said, though her funds were limited and would need to be stretched carefully through the winter months. "And I am skilled in healing, both traditional and modern medicine. I can also sew, cook, clean, and manage a household. If the town needs someone to care for Rose, I am more than capable of fulfilling that responsibility." She spoke with quiet confidence, listing abilities that had been dismissed by Thomas Brennan but might prove valuable in different circumstances. The ticket master nodded slowly, considering the practical benefits of this arrangement against whatever concerns he might have about a Chippewa woman taking charge of a white child. "Reckon I'll need to talk to Sheriff Morrison about the legal aspects. But off the record, miss, you'd be doing this town a favor by taking the girl off our hands. She's a good child, but folks are stretched thin as it is, and nobody's got the resources to take on another mouth to feed through what's looking to be a hard winter." As they spoke, the sound of approaching hoofbeats echoed across the platform, accompanied by the creak of wagon wheels and the low voices of men conducting business with the grim efficiency of those accustomed to making difficult decisions quickly. Naimana turned to see a small group of horsemen approaching the station, led by a man whose silver badge caught the afternoon light and whose bearing suggested he was accustomed to being obeyed without question. Sheriff Morrison was younger than Naimana had expected, perhaps 35, with the weathered face of someone who spent most of his time outdoors and the careful eyes of a man who had seen enough trouble to recognize it before it fully developed. Behind him rode two deputies and a well-dressed man in a black coat who could only be Judge Crawford, his pale face and soft hands marking him as someone more comfortable with law books than frontier justice. "Afternoon, Charlie," Sheriff Morrison called to the ticket master as he dismounted, his gaze moving quickly over the scene before settling on Naimana with the professional assessment of someone evaluating a potential problem. "Heard we had a situation with the Donovan girl and some kind of arrangement being discussed. Thought we better come see what's what before folks start making plans that might not work out so well for anybody involved." Rose pressed closer to Naimana's side, her small body tense with the wariness of a child who had learned that official attention usually meant more disruption and uncertainty rather than solutions to her problems. Judge Crawford remained mounted, looking down at them with the expression of someone reviewing evidence in a case he found distasteful but necessary to resolve, his pale eyes taking in Naimana's traditional beadwork and moccasins with obvious disapproval. "Sheriff Morrison," Naimana said, inclining her head respectfully while keeping her voice steady and clear. "I am Naimana Starweaver. I came to Copper Ridge to marry Thomas Brennan, but he chose not to honor his commitment. I have encountered young Rose who appears to be in need of care and protection, and I have offered to provide both. I understand. There may be legal procedures to follow, and I am prepared to comply with whatever requirements you deem necessary." The directness of her statement seemed to catch the sheriff slightly off guard, as if he had expected evasion or defensiveness, rather than this calm acceptance of official scrutiny. He studied her face for a long moment, clearly trying to reconcile her composed demeanor with whatever preconceptions he might have held about Native American women and their place in white society. 2 days later, Main Street, Copper Ridge. The morning sun cast long shadows across the muddy street as Naimana walked toward Henderson's general store with Rose's small hand tucked securely in hers, both of them wearing the same clothes they'd arrived in, but now carrying themselves with the quiet dignity of people who had found something worth protecting in each other. The town was beginning to stir with its daily rhythm of commerce and survival, shopkeepers sweeping their storefronts, ranchers loading supplies into weathered wagons, and miners stumbling from the saloon with the hollow-eyed look of men who drank to forget the darkness they descended into each day, seeking copper and silver in the unforgiving mountain stone. Sheriff Morrison had granted them temporary guardianship after a tense conversation in his office where Judge Crawford had expressed serious reservations about placing a white child with a Native American woman, his concerns thinly veiled behind legal language that spoke of cultural compatibility and community standards, while his pale eyes conveyed the deeper prejudice that saw Naimana as fundamentally unsuited for civilized society. The arrangement was provisional. requiring them to find suitable housing and demonstrate Nahimana's ability to provide for Rose's needs while the town watched and evaluated whether this unusual family could function within the boundaries of what Copper Ridge deemed acceptable. Mrs. Henderson stood behind the counter of her general store, like a fortress commander surveying a battlefield, her gray hair pulled back in a severe bun that matched the tight line of her mouth as she watched. Nahimana and Rose approached through the front window. The woman had reluctantly provided Rose with occasional meals and shelter over the past month, but her charity had come with constant reminders of its temporary nature and the burden Rose represented to people who had their own struggles to manage. In this harsh frontier environment, "Morning, Mrs. Henderson," Rose said with the careful politeness she'd learned during her weeks of depending on the woman's grudging kindness. "I came to thank you for taking care of me and to let you know I won't be needing to sleep in your back room anymore. Miss Nahimana is going to be my family now, and we're going to find our own place to live." Mrs. Henderson's expression shifted from surprise to skepticism as she studied Nahimana with the evaluating gaze of someone accustomed to making quick judgments about character and trustworthiness. "Is that so? And where exactly do you plan to live, child?" "Housing's scarce in Copper Ridge, especially for folks who don't have established connections or references from respectable families. Most landlords are particular about their tenants, particularly when it comes to situations that might cause talk among the decent people of this community." The words carried layers of meaning that Nahimana understood perfectly, the polite way of saying that a Chippewa woman and a white orphan would find few doors open to them in a town where conformity to social expectations was often the difference between acceptance and exile. She had faced such subtle rejection before, the careful language that excluded without explicitly acknowledging the prejudice behind the exclusion. But this time she had Rose to consider, a child whose future depended on Nahimana's ability to navigate these social barriers with patience and strategic thinking. "We will find something suitable," Nahimana replied with quiet confidence, her English precise and unaccented in the way that often surprised white settlers who expected broken speech or primitive communication from Native Americans. "I have some savings and I am skilled in medicine and healing. Perhaps there are people in this community who would value those abilities more than they fear what they do not understand about my heritage." Mrs. Henderson's eyebrows rose slightly at this response, clearly not expecting such articulate self-advocacy from someone she had mentally categorized as both foreign and inferior. "Medicine, you say? What kind of medicine?" "We've got Doc Peterson for serious ailments, and most folks around here don't hold much truck with Indian superstitions and herb remedies when it comes to real sickness and injury. I learned traditional healing from my grandmother, who was known throughout our region for her knowledge of plants and their medicinal properties," Nahimana explained patiently, recognizing the opportunity to establish her credibility through practical demonstration rather than argument. "But I also studied with the reservation doctor, learning modern medical techniques and the use of contemporary medicines. I can treat everything from winter coughs to broken bones, and I have experience helping women through difficult births." When no doctor was available, before Mrs. Henderson could respond, the store's front door opened with a sharp chime that announced the arrival of Sarah Mackenzie, a woman in her 30s whose pale complexion and trembling hands immediately suggested someone in distress. She clutched a shawl around her shoulders despite the warmth of the store's interior, and her eyes held the desperate look of someone who had exhausted conventional options and was grasping for any possibility of relief. "Mrs. Henderson, Sarah," sighed, her voice tight with barely controlled panic. "I need to send word to Billings for Doc Carson to come out. It's my husband, Jim. He took a fall from the barn roof this morning while trying to patch the hole before the snow comes, and something's wrong with his leg. It's bent in a way that ain't natural, and he's in such pain he can't even speak proper." Words. Mrs. Henderson's face immediately reflected the gravity of the situation, understanding as well as anyone in Copper Ridge that a serious injury to the primary breadwinner of a family could mean the difference between survival and destitution. In the harsh reality of frontier life, Doc Carson's clear over in Billings, Sarah. Even if I could get word to him today, he couldn't make it out here before tomorrow night at the earliest. And that's assuming the weather holds and the trails stay passable. Sarah's composure cracked. At this news, tears beginning to stream down her cheeks as she contemplated the prospect of watching her husband suffer through the night with no professional medical attention available. He's burning up with fever, and I don't know what to do. The bones poking through the skin, and I'm afraid he's going to die if someone said'll help him soon. We've got 3 little ones depending on him, and I can't lose him. I just can't. Nahimana stepped forward before she could second-guess the impulse, her healer's instincts overriding any concern about how her offer might be received by either Sarah or the wider community. Mrs. Mackenzie, I have medical training and experience treating compound fractures. If you would allow me to examine your husband, I might be able to help stabilize his condition until proper medical care can be arranged. Sarah turned toward Nahimana as if noticing her for the first time, her desperate gaze taking in the traditional beadwork and moccasins that marked her as Native American. For a moment, the ingrained prejudices of her upbringing warred with the immediate need for help, her face reflecting the internal struggle between social conditioning and maternal desperation that recognized no boundaries of race or culture when her family's survival was at stake. "You're a doctor?" Sarah asked, her voice carrying a mixture of hope and uncertainty that suggested she was willing to consider any possibility but needed reassurance that this unexpected offer of help came from genuine medical knowledge rather than dangerous ignorance, dressed up as expertise. "You've treated injuries like this before? Because if Jim gets worse because of something you do wrong, I don't know how I'll live with myself. I am not a doctor in the way white medicine defines that term," Nahimana replied honestly, understanding that her credibility depended on transparency about her limitations, as well as her capabilities. "But I have set bones, cleaned wounds, and treated fever in circumstances where no other help was available. I have seen compound fractures before, and I know how to prevent infection and manage pain while the body begins its natural healing process." Mrs. Henderson watched this exchange with obvious fascination, clearly recognizing the test case unfolding before her eyes as Nahimana's first opportunity to demonstrate her medical skills to the white community. "I will need to gather some supplies," Nahimana said, turning to Mrs. Henderson with a businesslike efficiency that suggested she was accustomed to making quick decisions in medical emergencies. "Clean cloth for bandages, alcohol for disinfection, and whatever pain medication you might have available." The Mackenzie farm appeared around a bend in the creek path 3 miles northwest of town. A modest collection of buildings that spoke of hard work and careful planning, but also the constant struggle to build something permanent in a landscape that tested human endurance with every change of season. Jim Mackenzie lay on a makeshift bed in the main room, his face gray with pain and fever, his injured leg grotesquely twisted beneath a blood-soaked blanket that his wife had used to cover the worst of the damage. Nahimana approached the injured man with the calm confidence that had served her well in previous medical emergencies, her hands steady despite the gravity of the situation as she carefully pulled back the blanket to assess the extent of the damage. The compound fracture was severe but not hopeless, the broken bone having torn through skin and muscle in a way that would require careful cleaning and precise realignment to prevent permanent disability or life-threatening infection. "Mr. Mackenzie," she said softly, placing her hand gently on his forehead to check his temperature, while establishing the kind of personal connection that often helped patients cooperate with painful but necessary medical procedures. "My name is Nahimana Starweaver, and I am here to help you. What I need to do will hurt, but it is necessary to save your leg and possibly your life. Do you understand?" Jim's eyes focused on her with difficulty, the pain and fever creating a fog that made concentration nearly impossible. "You're the Indian woman," he said weakly, his voice carrying no judgment or prejudice, only the desperate gratitude of someone who understood that help had arrived, regardless of its unexpected source. Sarah said, "You know about doctoring. I don't care what color you are if you can make this stop hurting so bad." Working by lamplight as the afternoon faded into evening, Nehemana cleaned the wound with careful precision, her movements guided by years of training and the intuitive understanding of anatomy that came from growing up in a culture where such knowledge was considered sacred rather than merely scientific. She realigned the broken bone with steady pressure and gentle manipulation, Jim's muffled cries of pain cutting through her concentration, but not deterring her from the work that could mean the difference between recovery and permanent disability. Sarah assisted with surprising skill, following Nehemana's instructions without question as they worked together to splint the leg and secure the bandages that would hold everything in place while the natural healing process began. The children watched from their corner with fascination rather than fear, their young minds more adaptable than adult prejudices when it came to accepting help from unexpected sources. By the time Nehemana finished her work, night had settled over the farm like a blanket, and Jim's fever had broken enough for him to speak coherently for the first time since his accident. "I don't know how to thank you," he said, his voice weak but clear. "Doc Peterson would have had to take the leg off if he'd seen it in this condition, but you've made it feel almost human again. The real test will come in the next few days." Nehemana cautioned, understanding that infection remained a serious threat despite her careful cleaning and bandaging of the wound. "I will return tomorrow to check the healing and change the bandages. You must keep the leg elevated and take the pain medicine Mrs. Henderson provided, but only as much as necessary to rest comfortably." Sarah walked with Nehemana to the door, her earlier reservations about accepting help from a Native American woman completely dissolved by the evidence of genuine medical skill and compassionate care. "I was wrong about you," she admitted quietly, her voice carrying the humility of someone whose assumptions had been challenged by direct experience. "I thought Indians only knew wild superstitions and dangerous remedies, but what you did tonight was real doctoring, better than anything I've seen from white physicians." The walk back to town took place under a canopy of stars that seemed close enough to touch in the clear mountain air. Nehemana's thoughts focused on the day's events and what they might mean for her and Rose's future in Copper Ridge. She had proven her medical skills to at least one family, but she knew that acceptance from the Mackenzies would need to be followed by similar demonstrations with other members of the community before they could truly consider themselves secure in their new home. Mrs. Henderson was waiting when Nehemana returned to the general store, Rose asleep on a makeshift bed behind the counter, her small face peaceful in the lamplight that cast gentle shadows across the store's familiar interior. "How is Jim?" Mrs. Henderson asked immediately, her concern genuine despite her earlier skepticism about Nehemana's capabilities. "He will recover if infection does not set in," Nehemana replied honestly. The bone was properly aligned, and the wound was clean enough to close without major complications. "I will monitor his progress over the next several days, but I believe he will keep his leg and eventually regain full use of it." Mrs. Henderson nodded with obvious satisfaction, clearly pleased that her decision to provide medical supplies had contributed to a successful outcome. "Sarah Mackenzie's got a big mouth when it comes to spreading news around this community," she observed with something approaching approval. "If Jim recovers like you say he will, there'll be folks lining up to ask for your help with their own medical problems." The implication was clear. Nehemana had passed her first major test as a potential member of the Copper Ridge community, demonstrating abilities that made her valuable regardless of the prejudices that might otherwise have kept her permanently on the margins of local society. She had found a path toward acceptance that depended on merit rather than charity, skills rather than tolerance, contribution rather than assimilation. Mrs. Henderson cleared her throat with the awkward formality of someone preparing to make An offer that surprised even herself. "About that housing situation," she said slowly. "There's a small cabin behind my store that I've been using for storage. It's not much, just 2 rooms and a kitchen area, but it's got a good roof and a working stove. If you're serious about setting up a medical practice here in town, you could rent it from me for a reasonable price." The offer represented more than simple accommodation, extending an opportunity for Naimana to establish herself as a legitimate medical practitioner with her own facility rather than someone who made house calls as a supplement to the town's existing physician. Rose sat up with excitement evident in her green eyes, clearly understanding that this conversation was about their future together and the possibility of having a real home rather than temporary shelter dependent on others' continued goodwill. "Yes, Rose," Nahamana said, her voice carrying the quiet confidence of someone who had found solid ground after a period of dangerous uncertainty. "We will have our own home, our own life, our own place in this community. We will prove ourselves through our actions rather than our words, and show them that family can take many forms." 1 month later, the cabin behind Henderson's store November had surrendered to December's iron grip, and the small cabin that Naimana and Rose now called home had transformed from a storage space cluttered with forgotten merchandise into something that resembled warmth and belonging despite its humble proportions. Rose had painted wildflowers on the kitchen walls with pigments Naimana had shown her how to make from local clay and berries, while Naimana had hung traditional drum catchers in the windows alongside lace curtains that Mrs. Henderson had donated from her store's old inventory. The front room served as a makeshift medical clinic where she treated everything from childbirth complications to mining injuries, her reputation growing with each successful healing that spread through Copper Ridge like seeds carried on winter wind. The morning brought an unexpected visitor in the form of Thomas Brennan himself, the man whose rejection at the train station had set this entire chain of events into motion, like a stone dropped into still water creating ripples that reached far beyond the original impact. He stood at their door with his hat in his hands and the uncomfortable expression of someone who had come to undo a decision that had seemed reasonable at the time, but now appeared foolish in light of subsequent developments. Behind him waited a buggy loaded with supplies and pulled by 2 well-fed horses that spoke of prosperity and success on his ranch, evidence of the comfortable life Nahamana might have shared if circumstances had unfolded differently. "Miss Starweaver," Thomas said, his voice carrying the careful formality of a man who understood he was treading on delicate ground. "I hope you'll forgive the intrusion, but I felt it necessary to speak with you about our previous arrangement and the way things ended between us. I've been hearing talk around town about your medical work and the good you've been doing for folks who needed help, and I wanted to set things right if possible." Rose peered around Naimana's skirts with the bold curiosity of a child who had learned to evaluate adult intentions quickly and accurately, her green eyes taking in Thomas's expensive clothes and well-groomed appearance with the calculating gaze of someone who understood that wealth often came with expectations and conditions that might threaten the security she had found in her new life. Naimana placed a protective hand on the child's shoulder, a gesture that spoke volumes about where her loyalties lay and what she considered most precious in her current circumstances. "Mr. Brennan," Nahamana replied with the cool politeness of someone who had moved beyond the hurt of rejection to find something more valuable than what had been originally offered. "You are welcome to speak, but I should tell you that my circumstances have changed considerably since our last encounter. I have found a home here in Copper Ridge and responsibilities that I would not abandon lightly." Thomas's gaze moved from Naimana to Rose and back again, clearly trying to understand the relationship between the Chippewa woman and the white child, whose presence complicated whatever proposal he had come to make. "I heard about the girl," he said carefully. "Folks say you've taken her in like she was your own kin. That's admirable, truly it is. But I came here today to offer you something that might benefit both of you in ways that this town never could." Words carried implications that made Nehemiah's spine stiffen with recognition of the patronizing attitude that assumed she would naturally prefer his belated offer to the life she had built through her own efforts and determination. "What exactly are you proposing, Mr. Brennan?" she asked, though part of her already suspected where this conversation was leading and felt no enthusiasm for the direction it might take. "I'm proposing we honor our original agreement," Thomas sighed, his voice gaining confidence as he warmed to his prepared speech. "I made a mistake that day at the station, letting fear and ignorance cloud my judgment about what kind of woman would make a suitable wife and partner. I've had time to reconsider, and I believe we could still make a good match if you're willing to give me another chance to prove myself worthy of your consideration." Rose's small hand tightened in Nehemiah's skirt, her child's intuition recognizing the threat this man represented to the stability and happiness they had worked so hard to create together. "Miss Nehemiah," she whispered urgently, "you're not going to leave me, are you? You promised we would be family, and families don't leave each other behind when someone offers them something better." The question pierced Nehemiah's heart like an arrow finding its mark, reminding her of the sacred trust this child had placed in her and the responsibility she had accepted when she chose love over convenience and commitment over opportunity. "No, little Rose," she said firmly, kneeling down to meet the child's eyes directly. "I will never leave you behind. We are family now, you and I, and nothing in this world could make me abandon that bond." Thomas watched this exchange with growing frustration, clearly unprepared for the depth of attachment that had formed between the woman he had rejected and the orphan child whose presence he had not factored into his calculations. "Miss Starweaver, please be reasonable," he said, his tone taking on the edge of a man accustomed to having his offers accepted gratefully rather than questioned or rejected. "I'm offering you a position as my wife, a respected place in this community, financial security, and a proper home. Surely that's worth considering, especially when you think about what's best for the child's future." "And what about Rose?" Nehemiah asked, rising to her full height with the dignity of someone who had learned to stand firm against pressure that sought to diminish her choices. "Does your generous offer extend to include her as well? Or did you imagine I would simply hand her over to someone else's care in order to accept your proposal? Because if that is what you're suggesting, then you understand nothing about the nature of love or family, or the commitments that truly matter in this life." The silence that followed this challenge stretched between them like a bridge neither seemed willing to cross. Thomas's discomfort, evident in his shifting posture, and the way his eyes avoided direct contact with either Nehemiah or Rose. "The child could be provided for," he said finally, his words carefully chosen to avoid making specific promises while still suggesting that arrangements might be possible. "There are good families in the territory who would welcome an orphaned girl, give her proper schooling and opportunities for advancement that she might not find in her current situation." Rose's face went pale at these words, her small body trembling with the recognition that this man was proposing to separate her from the only person who had ever made her feel truly wanted and protected. "I don't want a different family," she said, her voice small but determined. "I want to stay with Miss Nehemiah. She reads me stories and teaches me about healing plants and makes me feel safe when the wind howls at night. I don't care about proper schooling if it means losing the only mama I've ever really had." The word mama hung in the air between them like a declaration of war against Thomas's assumptions about what constituted proper family arrangements. And Nehemiah felt her heart swell with fierce protectiveness for this brave child, who had claimed her as family despite all the social conventions that said such a bond was impossible or inappropriate. "Mr. Brennan," she said, her voice carrying the finality of someone who had made an irrevocable decision, "I appreciate your offer, but I must decline. My life is here now with Rose, building something meaningful through my medical practice and our shared commitment to each other's well-being. Thomas's expression darkened with the frustrated anger of a man who had expected gratitude rather than rejection, his face reflecting the wounded pride of someone who believed his offer represented such obvious advancement that only foolishness could explain its refusal. "You're making a mistake," he said, his voice taking on the threatening undertone of someone accustomed to getting his way through intimidation when persuasion failed. "This town's tolerance for your unusual situation won't last forever, especially when winter hardships make people look for someone to blame for their troubles. You think they'll keep accepting an Indian woman raising a white child when food gets scarce and temperatures drop below survival levels?" The words carried the weight of prophecy rather than mere warning, and Naimana felt a chill that had nothing to do with the December cold settling around her heart as she recognized the truth behind Thomas's threat. She had been so focused on building her medical practice and caring for Rose that she had perhaps underestimated the fragility of their acceptance in a community where prejudice lurked just beneath the surface of practical tolerance. "Are you threatening us, Mr. Brennan?" she asked quietly, her voice steady despite the growing awareness that this conversation represented more than a rejected suitor's wounded feelings. "Because if you are, I should remind you that I have treated injuries and illness for half the families in this town, and they have seen the quality of my care and the genuine nature of my commitment to their well-being. That carries weight in a frontier community where actions matter more than bloodlines." "I'm not threatening anyone," Thomas replied with the false reasonableness of someone whose words carried implications he was careful not to state directly. "I'm simply observing that winter changes people's perspectives about what they can afford to tolerate and what they need to protect. When resources get scarce and survival becomes uncertain, communities tend to look inward to take care of their own first and worry about outsiders later. You might find that medical skills don't guarantee acceptance when people start choosing sides based on deeper loyalties." Before Naimana could respond to this ominous prediction, the sound of approaching hoofbeats announced the arrival of another visitor, this one riding hard with the urgency of someone carrying news that could not wait for convenience or proper timing. Sheriff Morrison pulled his horse to a sliding stop in front of the cabin, his face grim with the expression of a lawman who had encountered a problem that threatened to spiral beyond his ability to control through normal means. "Miss Starweaver," he called out without dismounting, his voice carrying the sharp edge of crisis that cut through whatever social niceties might normally have preceded such an abrupt interruption. "I need you to come with me right now. There's been an accident at the Copper Creek mine, cave-in with multiple injuries, and Doc Peterson's too drunk to stand upright, let alone perform surgery. The mining company's sending riders to Billings for a real doctor, but that'll take 2 days minimum, and some of these men won't last 2 hours without proper medical attention." Thomas stepped back involuntarily as Sheriff Morrison's urgent summons transformed the morning's domestic drama into something far more serious. The reality of frontier medical emergencies suddenly making his marriage proposal seem petty and self-serving by comparison. Naimana felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that came with medical crises, her mind already cataloging the supplies she would need and the procedures that might be required to treat crushing injuries and potential internal bleeding. "How many men are trapped?" she asked, already moving toward the cabin to gather her medical kit and whatever supplies she could carry. "And what kind of injuries are we dealing with? Broken bones, head trauma, breathing difficulties? I need to know what to prepare for before we reach the site." 7 men total, 4 already pulled out and 3 still trapped behind a wall of fallen rock. Sheriff Morrison replied, his professional composure barely containing the urgency that drove his words. "The ones who are out have various degrees of crushing injuries. One man's got what looks like a punctured lung, and another's bleeding internally from something that got torn up when the roof beam caught him across the middle." Doc Peterson took one look at the worst case, and started reaching for his bottle instead of his medical bag. Rose tugged at Nahimana's coat with the desperate urgency of a child who understood that this emergency might take her protector away. Just when Thomas Brennan's presence had already made their security feel uncertain and threatened. "I want to come with you," she said, her voice small but determined. "I can help carry things and stay out of the way while you work on the hurt men. Please don't leave me here alone with him." The plea in Rose's voice cut through Nahimana's professional focus, reminding her that accepting Sheriff Morrison's summons meant leaving the child vulnerable to whatever pressure Thomas might apply in her absence. But the knowledge that injured men would die without immediate medical intervention created an impossible choice between her responsibilities as a healer and her duties as Rose's protector and guardian. "Mr. Brennan will be leaving immediately," Nahimana said with firm authority, turning to face the man whose proposal had suddenly become an unwelcome complication, rather than a simple matter to be declined politely. "And Rose will come with me to the mine site. She has assisted me with medical procedures before and knows how to be helpful rather than disruptive in emergency situations." Thomas's face flushed with anger at this summary dismissal, his wounded pride evident in the tight line of his mouth and the way his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "This conversation isn't over," he said, his voice carrying the promise of future confrontation rather than acceptance of her decision. "You're making choices based on emotion rather than practical consideration of what's best for everyone involved. And that kind of thinking leads to regret and suffering for people who don't deserve to pay the price for your stubbornness." Sheriff Morrison's patience finally snapped at this display of petty personal drama in the face of life-threatening emergency. "Brennan, you can take your hurt feelings somewhere else," he said sharply. "Right now I've got men dying while you're standing here arguing about marriage proposals and domestic arrangements. Get out of the way or get gone, but stop wasting time that could mean the difference between life and death for people who actually matter in this situation." The harsh rebuke sent Thomas retreating toward his buggy with the deflated posture of someone whose importance had been suddenly and publicly diminished, but his parting glance at Nahimana carried the cold promise of someone who did not forget slights or abandon plans simply because of temporary setbacks. Rose pressed closer to Nahimana's side as they watched him drive away, her child's intuition recognizing that this man represented a threat that would not disappear simply because it had been temporarily postponed. The ride to Copper Creek mine took them through landscape that grew increasingly desolate as they left the relative civilization of town behind, through the scarred hillsides where men descended into darkness each day, seeking the mineral wealth that drove frontier expansion. The mine entrance was surrounded by chaos, injured men lying on makeshift stretchers while their uninjured colleagues paced helplessly nearby, their faces blackened with coal dust and etched with the terror of those who had narrowly escaped death. Themselves, Nahimana dismounted before her horse had fully stopped, her medical training taking over as she assessed the scene with the quick professional evaluation that separated the salvageable from the hopeless and determined the order in which limited resources should be applied. The man with the punctured lung required immediate attention to prevent drowning in his own blood, while the one with internal injuries needed careful monitoring to determine whether surgery might be attempted or whether comfort care was the only realistic option. "Rose," she said quietly, kneeling down to meet the child's eyes with the serious expression of someone entrusting important responsibility to a capable assistant. "I need you to stay close but not interfere while I work on these men. Can you help me by organizing supplies and keeping track of bandages and medicines, so I don't have to stop what I'm doing to look for what I need?" The child nodded solemnly, understanding that this was more than busy work designed to keep her occupied, but genuine assistance that would make the difference between efficient treatment and dangerous delays. As Nahimana began her work, Rose moved with quiet competence to arrange medical supplies in logical order and anticipate what might be needed next, her small hands steady despite the gruesome sights that would have sent many adults fleeing in. Horror, working by torchlight as afternoon faded toward evening. Naimana performed procedures that pushed the boundaries of frontier medicine, drawing on both traditional knowledge and modern techniques to address injuries that would have challenged physicians with fully equipped hospitals at their disposal. The man with the punctured lung required a delicate procedure to relieve pressure in his chest cavity, while the one with internal bleeding needed careful monitoring and gradual treatment to prevent shock while his body attempted to heal itself. The miners watched her work with growing respect and amazement, their initial skepticism about accepting medical care from an Indian woman replaced by gratitude as they witnessed skills that clearly exceeded anything Doc Peterson could have provided. Even on his best days, Sheriff Morrison assisted when needed, following her instructions without question as she directed efforts to stabilize the injured men for eventual transport to more sophisticated medical facilities. As the last patient was stabilized and preparations began for moving the injured men to town, Rose approached Naimana with the quiet pride of someone who had proven herself capable under pressure. "Did I do good?" she asked softly. "I tried to help the way you taught me, keeping everything clean and organized so you could work faster." "You did wonderfully," Naimana replied, gathering the exhausted child into her arms with the fierce love of someone who had found family in the most unexpected circumstances. "You were brave and helpful, and exactly the kind of assistant every healer dreams of having. I am proud to call you my daughter, not just in my heart, but in front of everyone who witnessed your courage today." The ride back to town took place under a star-filled sky that seemed to promise peace after the day's crisis. But Naimana's thoughts were troubled by Thomas Brennan's threats and the growing awareness that their acceptance in Copper Ridge might prove more fragile than she had hoped. The successful treatment of the mining accident would certainly enhance her reputation as a healer, but it might also increase the attention and scrutiny that could make their unusual family arrangement a target for those who saw them as threats to established social order. Sheriff Morrison rode beside them in thoughtful silence for most of the journey, but as they approached the outskirts of town, he finally spoke the words that had been weighing on his mind throughout the day's events. "Miss Starweaver, I want you to know that what you did today saved lives that would have been lost without your skills and courage. But I also want you to be aware that there are people in this community who might see your growing influence as something that needs to be checked before it challenges their ideas about how things should be." The warning carried the weight of official recognition that their situation was becoming politically complicated rather than simply medically useful, and Naimana understood that the success of her healing practice had paradoxically made her more vulnerable to attack from those who felt threatened by a Native American woman's growing importance in their community. "What are you suggesting, Sheriff?" she asked quietly. "I'm suggesting you be careful about making enemies of people who have the power to cause you real trouble," Morrison replied with the blunt honesty of a lawman who had seen how quickly frontier justice could turn personal when emotions ran high. Thomas Brennan's got influence with the territorial government and connections that reach beyond Copper Ridge. If he decides to make life difficult for you and the girl, he's got ways to do it that might not be easy to fight through normal legal channels. Rose had fallen asleep against Naimana's shoulder during the ride, her small body finally surrendering to exhaustion after the day's intense experiences. But even in sleep she seemed to sense the tension in the adult conversation taking place above her head. Naimana adjusted her grip on the child protectively, feeling the weight of responsibility that came with loving someone whose welfare depended entirely on her ability to navigate the dangerous currents of frontier politics and social prejudice. "We will face whatever comes," she said finally, her voice carrying the quiet determination of someone who had already lost too much to surrender what she had found without a fight. "Rose and I have built something worth protecting here, and I will not let fear or threats drive us away from the home we have made together. If Thomas Brennan wants to destroy what we have created, he will discover that some things are worth fighting for regardless of the cost." 2 weeks later, Christmas Eve, 1889. The blizzard that had been threatening Copper Ridge for 3 days finally arrived with the vengeance of winter unleashed, transforming the town into an isolated island surrounded by howling wind and snow so thick it swallowed buildings whole. Just 50 yards from where you stood, Naimana pressed her face against the frosted window of their cabin, watching the storm with the growing unease of someone who understood that natural disasters often provided cover for human malice to flourish, unchecked by normal social constraints. Rose sat by the fire stitching careful patterns into a piece of cloth with the concentrated attention of a child creating something precious, her small tongue poking out slightly as she worked on what she had secretly planned as a Christmas gift. For the woman who had become her salvation and anchor in an uncertain world, the knock at their door came near midnight, barely audible above the wind's relentless howling, but persistent enough to suggest either genuine emergency or determined malice that would not be deterred by weather that had driven sensible people to seek shelter hours ago. Naimana approached the door with caution learned from months of navigating frontier politics, her hand resting on the medical bag that had become both her livelihood and her protection against those who might question her right to exist peacefully in their community. "Who's there?" she called through the thick wooden planks, not opening the door until she could identify the visitor and assess whether their presence represented help or threat in the storm-shrouded darkness that had transformed familiar streets into alien landscape where friend and enemy became indistinguishable shadows moving through the white chaos outside their fragile shelter. "It's Father Miguel from the mission," came the reply, barely audible through the door and the storm's fury. "I need medical help urgently. There's been an accident at the church and several people are injured. Doc Peterson's nowhere to be found, and you're the only person in town with the skills to handle serious trauma. Please, people are dying while we stand here talking." Naimana recognized the priest's voice, despite its distortion by wind and urgency, the Spanish accent that marked him as one of the few people in Copper Ridge who had shown genuine kindness to both her and Rose without reservation or conditional acceptance, based on her usefulness to the community. Father Miguel had been the first person to welcome them to Sunday services without requiring them to sit in the back or endure whispered comments about their unconventional family arrangement. She opened the door to find the priest wrapped in a heavy coat that was already white with accumulated snow, his dark eyes reflecting genuine distress as he explained the situation that had brought him out into the storm despite the obvious danger of traveling through weather that could kill the unprepared or unlucky within minutes of losing their way. "What kind of accident?" Naimana asked, already reaching for her medical supplies while her mind cataloged the equipment she might need for various types of emergency treatment. "The church roof collapsed under the weight of snow and ice," Father Miguel explained, stamping his feet to restore circulation while brushing snow from his coat with hands that shook from cold rather than fear. "We were holding Christmas Eve service when the main beam gave way, and half the congregation was trapped under falling timber and debris. I've got men digging people out, but some of the injuries are beyond anything I know how to treat with prayer and good intentions." Rose looked up from her sewing with the immediate alertness of a child who had learned to recognize the signs of medical emergency, her green eyes reflecting understanding that this Christmas Eve was about to become something very different from the quiet celebration they had planned together. "Should I come help?" she asked, setting aside her needlework with the matter-of-fact acceptance of someone who had already proven her value as a medical assistant under pressure. "Not this time, little one," Naimana said gently, recognizing that a church roof collapse would likely involve injuries too severe and traumatic for a 7-year-old child to witness, even one as brave and capable as Rose had proven herself to be during previous emergencies. "This is Christmas Eve, and you should stay warm by the fire with your sewing. I'll be back as soon as I can to hear about what you've been working on so carefully." But even as she spoke the words, Nahimana felt the familiar tug of concern about leaving Rose alone in their cabin, while Thomas Brennan's threats still echoed in her memory like storm warnings that had not yet been proven false. The blizzard that made travel dangerous also provided perfect cover for someone with malicious intent to approach their home without being seen by neighbors or potential witnesses. Father Miguel seemed to sense her hesitation, his perceptive eyes taking in the protective way. She glanced back at Rose and the calculation that flickered across her face as she weighed competing responsibilities. The child would be welcome at the mission, he offered. Sister Catherine is there helping with the wounded, and she could watch over Rose while you work. It might be safer than leaving her alone during a storm this severe. The suggestion made practical sense, but something in the priest's tone suggested urgency that went beyond normal medical emergency protocols, as if he understood dangers that he was not yet ready to name directly. Father, is there something specific I should know about tonight's situation beyond the church collapse? Nahimana asked, her healer's intuition detecting undercurrents that had nothing to do with accident or natural disaster. The priest's expression grew troubled as he glanced around the storm-shrouded darkness that surrounded their cabin, like a living thing intent on swallowing all light and warmth from the world. There have been men asking questions about you and the child, he admitted reluctantly. Strangers who came to town just before the blizzard hit, claiming to be territorial officials conducting some kind of investigation into irregular custody arrangements and medical practices by unqualified practitioners. The words hit Nahimana like physical blows, confirming her worst fears about Thomas Brennan's threats and the reach of his influence beyond the boundaries of Copper Ridge itself. What kind of questions? She asked, though part of her already knew the answer would involve challenges to her competence as a healer and her fitness to care for a white child in a society that viewed both roles as properly belonging to people who looked nothing like her. Questions about your medical training, your legal status as Rose's guardian, whether you're practicing medicine without proper certification from territorial authorities. Father Miguel replied with the grim expression of someone who had recognized a coordinated attack disguised as official inquiry. The kind of questions that suggest someone with connections and resources has decided to use bureaucratic weapons to accomplish what social pressure could not achieve. Rose had been listening to this conversation with the sharp attention of a child who had learned that adult discussions often contained information crucial to her security and survival. And now she moved closer to Nahimana with the unconscious seeking of protection that marked her as someone who had experienced abandonment too recently to take safety for granted. Are they going to try to take me away from you? She asked quietly, her small voice carrying the weight of someone who had already endured too many separations and losses. No one is taking you anywhere, Nahimana said firmly, kneeling down to meet Rose's eyes with the fierce determination of someone who had found something worth fighting for, regardless of the odds or consequences. We are family, you and I, and no amount of paperwork or official interference will change that bond. But we may need to be very careful about how we handle the challenges that are coming our way. Father Miguel watched this exchange with the compassionate understanding of someone who had seen too many families destroyed by forces beyond their control, his weathered face reflecting both sympathy for their plight and recognition of the limited protection he could offer against determined persecution backed by territorial authority. The mission can provide sanctuary, he said carefully. Church law still carries weight even in frontier territories, and there are precedents for protecting those who seek refuge from unjust persecution. The offer represented both hope and acknowledgement of how desperate their situation had become. The fact that a Catholic priest was suggesting sanctuary, indicating that normal legal channels might prove inadequate protection against whatever Thomas Brennan had set in motion through his political connections. Nahimana felt the weight of decision pressing down on her like the snow that threatened to collapse more roofs before this storm ended. First we deal with tonight's medical emergency, she decided, understanding that her reputation as a healer remained her strongest defense against those who would portray her as unfit or dangerous. Then we face whatever comes next with the knowledge that we have friends as well as enemies in this community, and that some bonds are stronger than the papers that officials wave around to justify their interference. The journey to the mission through the blizzard was treacherous beyond anything Naimana had experienced. The wind driving snow with such force that it felt like being pelted with frozen sand, while visibility dropped to mere arm's length despite the lantern Father Miguel carried like a beacon in the white chaos that had transformed familiar streets into an alien maze where wrong turns could prove fatal within minutes. Rose pressed close between them, her small body providing warmth while accepting protection from adults who understood that survival depended on staying together no matter how difficult the going became. The mission church presented a scene of controlled chaos when they finally reached its heavy wooden doors. Injured parishioners laid out on makeshift stretchers while uninjured congregation members worked frantically to clear debris and tend to wounds that ranged from minor cuts and bruises to potentially life-threatening internal injuries that would challenge even experienced surgeons working in fully equipped hospitals, rather than a frontier church lit by candles and heated by a single wood stove. Sister Catherine, a sturdy woman in her 50s whose calm efficiency under pressure suggested extensive experience dealing with frontier emergencies, immediately took charge of Rose with the gentle authority of someone accustomed to caring for children who had been traumatized by circumstances beyond their control. "Come with me, dear," she said, leading Rose toward a corner of the church where other children were being kept occupied and protected from the worst sights of the rescue effort. Naimana surveyed the injured with the quick professional assessment that separated the critical from the stable and determined the order in which her limited time and supplies should be deployed for maximum effect. A middle-aged rancher named Collins had a severely crushed leg that would require immediate attention to prevent him from bleeding to death, while Mrs. Patterson from the general store showed signs of internal injury that might prove beyond the scope of frontier medical treatment, even under ideal conditions. "Father, I need you to organize the helpers," Naimana said, falling into the command presence that medical emergencies demanded from those qualified to make life and death decisions. "Clean water, as much clean cloth as you can find for bandages, and anything that can serve as splints for broken bones. Also, I'll need some of the stronger men to help hold patients still while I work on the worst injuries." Working by flickering candlelight that cast dancing shadows across the scene of destruction, Naimana began the delicate process of triaging injuries and determining which patients could be saved with available resources versus those whose conditions were too severe for frontier medicine to address effectively. The work required not only medical skill but the emotional resilience to make decisions that would haunt her long after the immediate crisis passed. Collins's leg injury proved even worse than initial examination had suggested, the crushing damage extending into areas that would require amputation if infection set in. But Naimana's careful cleaning and precise suturing managed to preserve enough healthy tissue that recovery remained possible if the patient could survive the next critical 48 hours. Mrs. Patterson's internal injuries were less dramatic, but potentially more dangerous, requiring careful monitoring and gentle treatment that pushed the boundaries of what could be accomplished without surgical facilities. As she worked, Naimana became aware of whispered conversations taking place among the uninjured parishioners. Fragments of discussion that suggested the territorial officials Father Miguel had mentioned were not merely conducting routine investigations but actively building a case designed to remove both her medical practice and her custody of Rose through coordinated legal and bureaucratic pressure that would be difficult to counter through normal channels. "They're saying she's not qualified to treat white folks," one voice murmured during a lull in the rescue activity. "That Indian medicine is too primitive and dangerous for civilized people to trust their lives to, especially when there's real doctors available in bigger towns who know modern techniques." but she's saved more lives in the past 2 months than Doc Peterson managed in the past 2 years. Another voice replied with the practical assessment of someone who had witnessed results rather than accepting theoretical arguments about racial superiority. My husband would be dead or crippled if she hadn't set his leg properly, and everyone knows it regardless of what some territorial bureaucrat wants to put in his official report. The debate continued in hushed tones while Naimana focused on her patients, understanding that her performance during this emergency would likely determine not only the immediate fate of the injured, but also the long-term viability of her position in Copper Ridge, and her ability to protect Rose from those who saw their family as an aberration that needed to be corrected through official intervention. By dawn, the blizzard had exhausted itself like a living thing that had spent all its fury against the human settlements huddled beneath its assault, leaving behind a landscape transformed by snowdrifts that reached second-story windows and silence so complete it seemed to muffle even thoughts before they could form completely. 7 of the 8 seriously injured parishioners had been stabilized successfully, their conditions ranging from painful but manageable to serious, but survivable with proper care and monitoring over the coming weeks. Mrs. Patterson, however, had succumbed to internal bleeding during the night, despite Nahamana's best efforts to stop the hemorrhaging that proved too severe for the limited resources available in a frontier mission church. Her death cast a shadow over the rescue effort's overall success, providing ammunition for those who would argue that Nahimana's medical practice represented dangerous amateur experimentation rather than legitimate healing, based on genuine knowledge and skill. "You did everything humanly possible," Father Miguel said quietly as they stood beside Mrs. Patterson's still form in the gray morning light that filtered through the church's damaged windows. Her injuries were too severe for any physician to treat successfully without proper surgical facilities and equipment that simply don't exist in this part of the territory. No one could have saved her under these circumstances, but Naimana understood that logic and medical reality would carry little weight against those who chose to interpret Mrs. Patterson's death as evidence of incompetence rather than acknowledgement of the limitations that frontier medicine imposed on even the most skilled practitioners. "They will use this against me," she said, with the weary recognition of someone who had learned to expect the worst from political enemies who disguised personal malice as public concern. Rose appeared at her side with the quiet approach of a child who had learned to read adult moods and recognize when comfort was needed more than conversation, her small hand slipping into Nahimana's with the simple gesture of solidarity that reminded them both that their bond transcended whatever criticism or persecution might be directed against their unconventional family arrangement. "Miss Nahimana saved lots of people last night," Rose said to Father Miguel, with the fierce loyalty of someone defending the person who had given her safety and love when the world had offered neither. Mrs. Patterson was hurt too bad for anybody to fix, but if Miss Naimana hadn't been here, lots more people would have died instead of getting better. That should count for something when people are deciding whether she's good at helping folks or not. The child's simple assessment cut through the complex political maneuvering that surrounded Naimana's situation, reducing the issue to its essential elements of competence and compassion that had nothing to do with racial prejudice or bureaucratic power struggles. Father Miguel smiled at Rose's earnest defense, recognizing the wisdom that sometimes emerged from innocence unburdened by adult assumptions about how the world should work. "You're absolutely right, dear," he said gently. "And there are many people in this community who understand exactly what your mother accomplished here last night, regardless of what others might choose to say about it. Sometimes the truth takes time to overcome the lies, but it usually manages to do so eventually. If good people are willing to stand up and speak for what they know to be right." The word mother hung in the air between them like a benediction that acknowledged the reality of their relationship, regardless of legal documents or social conventions. And Naimana felt her heart swell with gratitude for this priest who had consistently recognized their family as valid and valuable, despite all the forces arrayed against such recognition. But their moment of quiet communion was shattered by the sound of approaching horses and voices that carried the official authority of territorial government rather than the neighborly concern of local community members checking on storm damage and rescue efforts. Through the church's broken windows, they could see a group of riders approaching the mission with the determined purpose of people conducting official business that would not be deterred by weather or circumstances. "They've come, Father," Miguel said quietly, his voice carrying the resignation of someone who had been expecting this confrontation but had hoped it might be delayed until the injured had been properly cared for and the immediate crisis had passed. "The territorial officials Thomas Brennan sent to investigate your situation and build a case for removing Rose from your custody. They'll want to examine your medical credentials and question your fitness as a guardian using last night's casualty as evidence that you represent a danger to the community." Nehemana straightened her shoulders with the dignity of someone preparing to face an enemy who had chosen the battlefield and timing but would discover that their intended victim possessed resources and allies they had not anticipated in their calculations. "Then we will meet them with the truth," she said firmly. "The truth about my medical training, my love for Rose, and my commitment to this community that has become our home. Let them make their accusations and present their evidence, and we will respond with facts and witnesses who know the reality of our lives rather than the fiction they have constructed to justify their interference." The next morning, Mission Courtyard. The territorial officials dismounted with the practiced efficiency of men accustomed to conducting business in hostile territory. Their leader, a thin man in an expensive coat whose pale hands and soft features marked him as someone more comfortable with paperwork than frontier realities. Behind him rode 3 deputies and a clerk carrying a leather satchel that presumably contained the legal documents needed to justify whatever actions they intended to take against Nehemana and Rose's fragile family arrangement. The morning sun cast sharp shadows across the snow-covered courtyard where injured parishioners were being moved to more comfortable quarters. The contrast between rescue efforts and official interference, creating a tableau that illustrated the difference between human compassion and bureaucratic indifference. "I am Territorial Administrator Whitman," the leader announced with the formal authority of someone who expected immediate compliance with his demands. "I'm here to investigate reports of unlicensed medical practice and irregular child custody arrangements that may violate territorial statutes regarding public safety and child welfare. I understand there was a medical emergency here last night that resulted in at least 1 fatality, which makes this investigation even more urgent and necessary." Father Miguel stepped forward with the quiet dignity of someone whose moral authority transcended government titles and official documents. His weathered face reflecting decades of experience dealing with bureaucrats who confused legal power with actual justice. "Administrator Whitman, these people have been through a traumatic experience and are still recovering from serious injuries. Perhaps your investigation could wait until they've had proper time to heal and process what happened to them during the church collapse. I'm afraid that's not possible," Whitman replied with the cold efficiency of someone who had rehearsed this conversation and would not be deterred by appeals to compassion or common decency. "When territorial citizens die under the care of unlicensed practitioners, we have a legal obligation to investigate immediately before evidence is lost or witnesses are influenced by those who might have something to hide. Mrs. Patterson's death makes this a matter of criminal investigation rather than simple administrative review." The words hung in the cold air like an accusation that transformed Nehemana from a healer who had saved 7 lives into a suspected criminal whose competence and motives were now officially questioned by the territorial government. Rose pressed closer to Nehemana's side with the instinctive recognition that this confrontation represented the greatest threat they had yet faced to their life together. "You want to question my medical abilities?" Nehemana said, stepping Forward with the calm courage of someone who had nothing to hide and everything to defend. Then question the people I've treated successfully. Ask Jim Mackenzie about his leg that would have been amputated by any other physician. Ask the miners, whose lives I saved when your licensed doctor was too drunk to stand upright. Ask the families who have children alive today, because I was willing to help when no one else was available. Collins, the rancher whose crushed leg Nahimana had treated during the night, struggled to sit up despite his injuries with the determination of someone who would not remain silent while his savior was attacked by officials who had contributed nothing to the community's welfare. "You listen here, mister," he said, his voice weak but filled with conviction. "That woman worked on my leg for 4 hours straight in candlelight, and she saved it when any fool could see it should have been cut off. If you're looking for criminal behavior, you might want to investigate why our official doctor spends more time with his bottle than his patients." "I understand your gratitude," Whitman replied with patronizing tolerance that suggested he had expected such testimonials and prepared responses to dismiss them. But emotional attachment to someone who provided care doesn't qualify her to practice medicine on territorial citizens. We have licensing requirements and educational standards for very good reasons, and allowing unqualified individuals to treat serious medical conditions puts the entire community at risk of exactly the kind of tragedy we witnessed last night. Sarah. Mackenzie emerged from the group of parishioners with the fierce determination of a woman whose family owed their survival to Nahimana's skill and compassion. "Mrs. Patterson was dying before Miss Starweaver even touched her," she said sharply. "The roof beam caught her across the chest and crushed her ribs into her lungs. Any doctor with eyes could see there was nothing to be done except make her comfortable, which is exactly what happened. If you want to blame someone for her death, blame the snow that brought down the roof, not the woman who tried to save her." More voices joined the defense as other parishioners found the courage to speak against official intimidation, their testimonials creating a chorus of support that challenged Whitman's narrative about dangerous incompetence and public menace. But the administrator seemed unmoved by community sentiment, his pale eyes fixed on Nahimana with the calculating gaze of someone who had come here with predetermined conclusions and would not be swayed by evidence that contradicted his mission. "These testimonials are noted for the record," Whitman said dismissively. "But my investigation must also consider the broader implications of allowing Native Americans to assume positions of authority over white children and medical practice in territorial communities. There are concerns about cultural compatibility and whether such arrangements serve the best interests of civilized society." The mask had finally slipped, revealing the racial prejudice that drove this investigation, more than any genuine concern for medical competence or child welfare. Rose looked up at Nahimana with understanding beyond her years, recognizing that this man's hatred was directed not at what they had done wrong, but at who they were and how they had dared to challenge social boundaries by creating a family that transcended racial categories. "You question my fitness to care for Rose because of my Chippewa heritage," Nahimana said quietly, her voice carrying the controlled anger of someone who had faced such prejudice before, but would not accept it silently when it threatened the child she loved. "But you cannot question the quality of care I have provided or the love that exists between us. She was orphaned and abandoned by your civilized society, sleeping in stables and surviving on scraps until I found her and gave her a home. Where was your concern for her welfare then? The child's previous circumstances don't justify irregular custody arrangements that violate territorial law," Whitman replied, signaling to his clerk who began removing documents from the leather satchel with practiced efficiency. "I have here a warrant for the immediate transfer of Rose Donovan to approved territorial custody, pending investigation of her current living situation. I also have an injunction prohibiting you from practicing medicine within territorial boundaries until your qualifications can be properly reviewed by licensed physicians." The papers fluttered in the cold wind like death sentences written in legal language, And Rose stepped behind Nahimana with the terror of someone who had experienced abandonment too recently to face the prospect of another separation from the only security she had ever known. "No," she said, her small voice growing stronger as she found courage in desperation. "I won't go with them. Miss Nahimana is my family, and families don't let strangers take their children away just because some man with papers says they have the right." Father Miguel moved to stand beside Nahimana and Rose, with the deliberate steps of someone choosing sides in a conflict that would define his own moral position as clearly as theirs. "Administrator Whitman, this child and this woman have found sanctuary in the church, and I invoke the ancient right of ecclesiastical protection that predates territorial law by centuries. They will remain here under church protection until this matter can be resolved through proper legal channels rather than bureaucratic intimidation." The invocation of sanctuary law clearly caught Whitman off guard, his confident expression wavering as he calculated whether his territorial authority extended to overriding church law in matters of protection for those seeking refuge from persecution. "Father, you're interfering with official territorial business," he said carefully. "I hope you understand the consequences of obstructing lawful government action. I understand the difference between lawful action and legalized persecution." The priest replied with the moral authority of someone whose conscience would not bend to political pressure. "This woman saved 7 lives last night under conditions that would have challenged any physician, and this child has found love and security that your bureaucracy seems determined to destroy. If protecting them from your misguided investigation is interference, then I accept that designation proudly." The standoff stretched between them like a bridge that neither side seemed willing to cross. Territorial authority confronting religious sanctuary in a conflict that would require legal resolution beyond the immediate power of either party to enforce their position through simple declaration. Whitman's pale eyes moved from Father Miguel to Nahimana to Rose, clearly calculating the political cost of forcibly removing them from church property against the risk of allowing them to remain free pending further legal maneuvering. "This matter is far from over," he said finally, his voice carrying the promise of renewed pressure through different channels. "Sanctuary provides temporary protection at best, and territorial law will eventually prevail over misguided religious sentiment. You're merely delaying the inevitable resolution of a situation that violates both legal statutes and social order." But as Whitman and his men prepared to withdraw, Collins struggled to his feet despite his injuries with the determination of someone who would not let this moment pass without making his position clear to everyone present. "You want to talk about social order?" he called out, his voice carrying across the courtyard with surprising strength. "The social order in Copper Ridge is that people help each other survive, regardless of what color they are or where they came from. That woman represents the best of what this community can be, and if you destroy that because of your prejudices, you'll answer to every family she's helped and every life she's saved." The rancher's words were echoed by murmurs of agreement from other parishioners, creating a groundswell of community support that suggested Whitman's investigation might face more resistance than anticipated from the very people it claimed to protect. As the territorial officials rode away through the snow-covered streets, their departure felt less like temporary withdrawal than strategic retreat in the face of unexpected opposition. Nahimana knelt down to embrace Rose with the fierce protectiveness of someone who had come too close to losing everything that mattered, understanding that their victory was temporary, but significant in ways that extended beyond their personal situation to encompass broader questions about justice and belonging. In frontier society, "We are safe for now," she whispered against Rose's hair. "But this fight is not over, and we must be prepared for whatever comes next." Father Miguel placed a gentle hand on Nahimana's shoulder with the blessing of someone who had chosen to risk his own position in defense of what he knew to be right. "The church will protect you as long as necessary," he promised. But you should know that this investigation was orchestrated by someone with considerable influence and resources. Thomas Brennan has powerful friends in the territorial government, and they won't give up easily when their first attempt fails to achieve the desired result. The morning sun climbed higher in the clear sky that followed the blizzard, casting long shadows across the mission courtyard, where two very different visions of frontier justice had collided and found temporary resolution through the ancient principle that some sanctuaries must remain inviolate, regardless of political pressure or social prejudice. But everyone present understood that this was merely the opening engagement in a longer struggle that would test not only Nahimana and Rose's determination to remain together, but also the community's willingness to defend those who had proven their worth through service rather than inheritance. 3 months later, spring 1890. Copper Ridge Courthouse. The territorial judge who arrived in Copper Ridge for the formal custody hearing bore little resemblance to the bureaucrats who had tried to intimidate Nahimana during the winter crisis. His weathered face and practical clothes suggesting someone who understood frontier realities better than legal theories, written by men who had never ventured west of comfortable eastern cities. Judge Samuel Harrison had built his reputation on fair decisions that considered human circumstances alongside written law, and his presence in their small courthouse represented the first genuine hope Nahimana had felt since Thomas Brennan's political machinations had begun threatening everything she held dear. The courtroom overflowed with townspeople who had come to witness what everyone understood would be the final determination of whether a Chippewa woman could legally keep the white orphan who had become her daughter in every way that mattered beyond bureaucratic documentation. Rose sat beside Nahimana wearing a new blue dress that matched her eyes, her small hand resting confidently in her guardian's larger one with the unshakable faith of someone who had never doubted where she belonged despite all the official attempts to convince her otherwise. Thomas Brennan occupied the front row with his expensive attorney and the smug expression of someone who believed political connections would inevitably triumph over sentiment and community support. His pale eyes fixed on Nahimana with the cold satisfaction of a man who had invested considerable resources in destroying what he could not possess. Behind him sat Administrator Whitman and several territorial officials, whose presence was meant to intimidate through the sheer weight of government authority arrayed against one woman's determination to protect the child she loved. But the other side of the courtroom told a very different story about community values and frontier justice, filled with families whose lives had been touched by Nahimana's healing skills and compassionate care during the harsh winter months that had tested everyone's survival instincts. Jim Mackenzie sat in the front row with his fully healed leg stretched out as live-in testimony to medical competence that transcended racial prejudice, while Sarah Mackenzie held their youngest child, who bore a small scar on his forehead where Nahimana had stitched a playground injury with the gentle precision that had earned their family's eternal gratitude. Judge Harrison called the proceedings to order with the authoritative rap of his gavel that silenced whispered conversations and focused everyone's attention on the legal drama about to unfold in their midst. This hearing will determine the permanent custody of Rose Donovan and the medical practice rights of Nahimana Starweaver, he announced in a voice that carried both fairness and finality. I expect to hear evidence rather than speeches, facts rather than opinions, and testimony that serves the best interests of the child rather than the political agendas of adults. Thomas Brennan's attorney rose first with the confident bearing of someone who believed the law was clearly on his side, his opening statement painting Nahimana as an unqualified impostor whose medical practice endangered public safety and whose custody of Rose violated both territorial statutes and social propriety. Your Honor, this case is fundamentally about whether we will allow sentiment to override law and permit dangerous precedents that threaten the very foundations of civilized society in our territorial communities. The attorney presented a litany of technical violations and regulatory infractions that made Nehemiah's healing work sound like criminal activity. His words designed to transform her from a beloved community healer into a dangerous charlatan who had somehow deceived an entire town into accepting substandard medical care. He spoke of licensing requirements and educational credentials as if they were more important than the actual results of treatment, reducing human healing to a matter of paperwork compliance. But when Father Miguel rose to speak as character witness, the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted dramatically toward something more fundamental than legal technicalities. Your Honor, I have witnessed this woman save lives when licensed physicians were unavailable or incapable, he said with the moral authority of someone whose calling transcended earthly politics. I have seen her care for the poorest patients with the same dedication she shows to those who can pay. And I have watched her raise Rose with love that any parent would be proud to claim. Collins followed with testimony that was both medically specific and emotionally powerful, describing how Nehemiah's surgical skill had saved his leg when amputation seemed inevitable, and how her follow-up care had restored full function despite the severity of his initial injury. She didn't just patch me up and send me home, he said firmly. She checked on my healing every day for weeks, adjusted my treatment when complications arose, and refused payment until she was certain I'd make a complete recovery, one by one. Community members rose to testify about medical emergencies where Nehemiah's intervention had meant the difference between life and death. Their stories creating a comprehensive picture of competence and compassion that no amount of bureaucratic criticism could diminish. Mrs. Henderson spoke about the mining accident victims who would have died without immediate treatment, while Sarah Mackenzie described the difficult birth where Nehemiah's traditional knowledge had saved both mother and baby when modern techniques proved inadequate. When Rose was finally called to speak for herself, she approached the witness stand with the composure of someone much older than her 8 years, her small voice carrying clearly through the courtroom as she answered Judge Harrison's gentle questions about her life with Nehemiah. She teaches me about healing plants and how to read people's hearts when they're hurting, Rose said with simple honesty. She makes me feel safe when storms come, and she never makes me feel like I'm too much trouble or eat too much food like other people used to say. Do you want to stay with Miss Starweaver? Judge Harrison asked, his experienced eyes recognizing genuine attachment when he saw it despite all the legal complexities that surrounded their situation. She's my mama, Rose replied with absolute certainty that cut through every legal argument and technical objection that had been raised against their family. Not because of papers or because someone said she had to be, but because she chose to love me when nobody else wanted to. That's what real families do. They choose each other, and then they stick together no matter what. The child's simple explanation of family bonds created a silence in the courtroom that spoke more powerfully than any legal brief about the essential human relationships that law was supposed to protect rather than destroy. Judge Harrison studied the faces before him, taking in the obvious love between Nehemiah and Rose, alongside the community support that surrounded them both. Thomas Brennan's attorney made one final attempt to salvage his case by arguing that emotional bonds could not override legal requirements and social norms, but his words sounded hollow after the testimony about actual lives saved and genuine family love, demonstrated through daily care and mutual devotion. Your Honor, he said desperately, we cannot allow personal feelings to establish precedents that undermine territorial authority and legal order. Judge Harrison's decision came without lengthy deliberation, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had seen enough of frontier life to understand what truly mattered when survival and civilization hung in the balance. This court finds that Nehemiah Starweaver has demonstrated both the medical competence and parental devotion necessary to continue her practice and maintain custody of Rose Donovan, he announced. Furthermore, this court recognizes that frontier communities require practical solutions to real problems rather than rigid adherence to regulations. written by people who have never faced the challenges of territorial life. The courtroom erupted in cheers that reflected months of tension finally released through official recognition of what the community had known all along, about the value of Nayamana's contributions and the authenticity of her family with Rose. Thomas Brennan's face darkened with fury at this public defeat, but he was powerless against a legal decision that had community support and judicial approval. As they left the courthouse together, Rose slipped her small hand into Nayamana's, with the confidence of someone whose security was no longer threatened by outside interference. "Are we really safe now?" she asked, looking up at the woman who had become her anchor in an uncertain world. "Yes, little one," Nayamana replied, her voice thick with gratitude for the community that had chosen to defend them and the judge who had seen past prejudice to recognize truth. "We are family forever now, you and I, with papers that say what our hearts have always known. No one can separate us again." The spring sun warmed their faces as they walked home through streets lined with neighbors who had risked their own, standing to support an unusual family that had proven love transcends the boundaries that society tries to impose on human connection. Behind them, the courthouse stood as witness to the day when frontier justice chose compassion over convention and recognized that the strongest families are often those built by choice rather than circumstance. In the distance, the mountains that surrounded Copper Ridge caught the afternoon light like a promise that some things endure beyond the temporary storms that test their strength. And Nayamana knew that she and Rose had found something more precious than gold in these hills, where an abandoned woman and an orphaned child had discovered that home is not a place, but the people who choose to love you unconditionally.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.